The silence in the training field was absolute. 30 recruits held their breath. The lonely archer, the man who never missed, the warrior who single-handedly decimated an enemy battalion in the Valdron Hills, stood still as a stone statue, his eyes fixed on the target 100 meters away. Not his target. On his target, pierced right in the center, a simple arrow trembled. An arrow of willow wood, with poorly trimmed goose feathers. A peasant's arrow. And beside him, with her bow still raised, a young woman with calloused hands and a patched dress kept her chin held high. Her brown eyes offered no apology. They didn't tremble. They challenged. The legendary Cale Thornwood, the man kings begged to train their armies, the ghost of the northern battles, had just been humiliated by a girl who smelled of wet earth and hay, and nobody, absolutely nobody, knew what he would do next. Before we continue, comment below where you're watching from. The winter of 1347 arrived at Fort Dunmore carrying more than snow. It carried rumors. They said Duke Aldrich himself had begged, that he offered lands, titles, even the hand of his youngest daughter, all to convince a single man to leave his exile in the mountains and train the kingdom's new regiment of archers. Cale Thornwood wanted none of that, but he came anyway. No one knew exactly why. Some whispered it was an old debt. Others swore he had received a letter sealed with black wax, the kind of letter no sensible man ignores, the kind that carries veiled threats or buried secrets. What everyone knew, however, was the legend. 15 years earlier, in the Valdron Hills, an army of 600 men marched to invade the province of Eastmere. They were northern mercenaries, brutal and experienced. The king didn't have enough troops to stop them. Defeat was certain. But then, for 3 consecutive nights, arrows began falling from nowhere. There was no sound of bowstrings, no silhouettes on the hills, just the sharp whistle in the air and bodies falling. Captains, scouts, sentinels. One by one, the mercenary leaders were eliminated with surgical precision. On the 4th day, the survivors fled, and in the shadows of the hills, they said, a single archer watched the rout. A man who was never seen, who was never officially named, who refused all reward and disappeared like smoke at dawn. Cale Thornwood, the lonely archer. Now, 15 years later, he walked through the muddy courtyard of Fort Dunmore with the same silent predator's step. The recruits waiting in line felt a collective shiver when he emerged from the shadows of the gate. He was older than they expected, perhaps 40 years, perhaps more. His black hair had silver threads at the temples, a thin scar cut from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. But his eyes were what held them, gray as storm clouds, cold as the steel of a newly forged blade, and completely empty of any human warmth. He stopped before the line of 30 young people and said nothing for a long moment. He just observed, analyzed, judged. There were noble sons there, with decorated bows and peacock-feathered arrows. There were hastily recruited peasants, holding worn equipment with nervous hands. There were 1 or 2 who looked promising, straight backs, relaxed shoulders, the posture of someone who had wielded a weapon before. And there was her, Helen Amaro. Cale didn't notice her immediately. She was at the end of the line, almost hidden behind a stocky young man. Short, thin, her coarse fabric dress stained with mud at the hem. The bow in her hands was a pitiful thing, poorly cured willow wood, hemp string already fraying. When his eyes finally found her, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Irritation. What was a peasant doing in military training? Who had allowed this farce? He looked at Captain Brennan, who commanded the fort, and saw the man look away with evident discomfort. Politics, probably. Some agreement with a landowner. Some empty promise made to some unimportant village. Cale snorted quietly. He had agreed to train archers, not to do charity. The morning sun was beginning to melt the frost on the ground when he finally spoke. His voice was deep, scratchy, like stones rolling in a dry stream. You are here because someone decided your lives are worth the time to be trained. I disagree with that assessment. A nervous murmur ran through the line. Over the next 3 months, I will turn some of you into archers. The others, well, the others will discover there are worse ways to die than an arrow in the chest. He began walking down the line, stopping before each recruit for an instant. Occasionally he made a sounded grunt of approval, a disapproving click of the tongue. When he reached the stocky young man, he stopped longer. Name: Aldrich Vane, sir, son of Baron Vane of. I didn't ask your lineage, I asked your name. Cale examined the ornate bow in the young man's hands. Did this bow belong to your father? To my grandfather, sir. It's a relic of, it's a useless relic. Too heavy for your shoulders, too decorated to be functional. Trade it for a practice bow or go home. Young Aldrich's face turned red with humiliation. Cale kept walking, and then he reached Helena. For a moment, he just stood there looking down at her from his full height. She was small, the top of her head barely reached his shoulder, but there was something in her posture that made him hesitate. She didn't tremble, didn't look away, didn't display the automatic submission that peasants normally showed before authority. She simply looked back at him, as if she were his equal. And you? Cale's voice carried a tone of sarcasm he didn't try to hide. Lost your way to the market? Some recruits laughed nervously. Helena didn't laugh. I came to train, sir. Like everyone else. Train. He repeated the word as if it had a bitter taste. With this, he pointed to her bow with disdain. This thing couldn't hit a barn at 10 paces. It hit rabbits at 50, sir. Fed my family for 3 winters. More laughter from the recruits. This time, genuine mockery. Cale raised an eyebrow. Rabbits. He took a step closer, his presence suddenly oppressive. I'm training soldiers, girl, not rabbit hunters. Go home. Tend to your sheep. Leave war to those born for it. Helena Morrow didn't move. And then she said something no one expected. Show me. The courtyard fell into absolute silence. What did you say? Cale's voice was dangerously low now. Show me that you were born for war. Show me what a real archer can do. For an instant, a single instant, something flickered in Cale Thornwood's gray eyes. Surprise? Amusement? It was impossible to tell. Then his lips curved into something that could almost be called a smile. Almost. Very well. He extended his hand to the side, and an assistant immediately placed a bow in his palm. It was a magnificent weapon, black yew cured for decades, elegant curves like raven wings, a silk-woven string that gleamed in the sunlight. Cale walked to the firing line without hurry. 100 meters away, a straw target waited, already marked by dozens of arrows from previous training sessions. He drew an arrow from his quiver, and then, in a movement so fluid it seemed like magic, he raised the bow, pulled the string to his ear, and released. The arrow cut through the air like lightning. It buried itself right in the center of the target. The recruits applauded, but Cale hadn't finished. Second arrow. Center. Third. Center. Fourth. Split the shaft of the third in half. Fifth. Sixth. Seventh. When he finished, 7 arrows formed a perfect pattern in the heart of the target, so close together their feathers touched. The silence that followed was one of pure reverence. Cale turned to Helena. That, he said with calculated coldness, is what a real archer can do. He expected her to lower her eyes, to apologize, to retreat to the end of the line and remain silent for the rest of training. But Helena Morrow did something different. She looked at the target for a long moment, then looked at Cale, and said, in a voice so calm it was almost disturbing, "May I try?" The wind shifted. It was a small detail, almost imperceptible. A breeze that had been coming from the east now blew from the northeast, carrying the scent of pines from the distant mountains. Most people in the courtyard didn't even notice. Helena noticed. She walked to the firing line with slow steps, her willow bough looking even more miserable in the direct sunlight. The recruits watched with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Baron Vane's son whispered something to his neighbor, and both suppressed giggles. Cale Thornwood remained motionless as a fishing heron, completely still, completely attentive. Something was wrong. He couldn't identify what, but his instincts, sharpened by decades of survival, screamed that something was wrong with this girl. It was the way she held the bow. Not with the brute force of a beginner trying to compensate for inexperience. Not with the trembling nervousness of someone about to humiliate themselves. She held that pitiful weapon with the naturalness of someone holding an extension of their own arm. Helena positioned her feet, and Cale frowned. The stance was wrong. Completely wrong. It wasn't the classical position taught in military academies. It wasn't the hunting posture peasants learned from their fathers. It was something else, something he didn't recognize. She raised the bow. The hemp string groaned in protest. And then Helena did something Kale had never seen before. She closed her eyes. Not for an instant. For 3 full seconds, she remained motionless with her eyes closed, the bow half raised, the arrow nocked but not drawn. Breathing. Feeling. The wind played with strands of her brown hair that escaped from her poorly made braid. When her eyes opened, something had changed. Not in her posture, not in her expression. In the air, it was as if the temperature itself had dropped 2 degrees, as if the world had become slightly quieter. The recruits felt it, that shiver on the back of their necks they couldn't explain. Kale felt it too, and for the first time in many years, his heart skipped a beat. Helena pulled the string. Not to her cheek, as common archers did. Not to her ear, as trained archers did. She pulled to an impossible point, the string passing her chin, almost touching her collarbone. A draw that should be physically impossible for her thin arms. The hemp string screamed. The willow bough bent as if it would break, and she released. No sound. There was no characteristic twang of a string being released. No whistle of air being cut. The arrow simply disappeared. One instant it was on the bow. The next instant, it was buried in the target. Not in any part of the target. In the exact center of Kale's 7 arrows. There was a space of perhaps 2 centimeters between the shafts, an impossible triangle where theoretically no arrow should fit. Helena's arrow was there, perfectly positioned. The silence that followed wasn't reverence. It was shock. Kale Thornwood took 3 steps forward before he realized he was moving. His eyes were fixed on the target, his mind refusing to process what he saw. It was impossible. With that bow, with that string, at that distance, with the wind that was blowing, it was mathematically, physically, absolutely impossible. And yet, he turned to Helena. The girl had lowered her bow. Her expression was neutral, almost bored, as if she hadn't just performed a shot that veteran archers spent entire lifetimes trying to master. "Who are you?" The question came out before Kale could contain it. Helena met his eyes, and for a moment that seemed to last an eternity, Kale saw something there. In the depths of those ordinary brown eyes, something ancient, something dangerous, something he recognized. "Helena Morrow," she answered calmly. "Daughter of Edmund Morrow, peasant, rabbit hunter." She paused. "Nothing more, sir." The lie was so obvious it almost had a smell. But before Kale could press her, Captain Brennan intervened. The man appeared at his side with all the subtlety of a bear in a china shop, smiling nervously. "Excellent demonstration, Master Thornwood. The troops' morale certainly improved with this little competition. Perhaps we should continue with regular training?" Kale ignored him. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Helena didn't answer immediately. She was storing the spare arrow in her quiver, a worn leather quiver that seemed to have more holes than fabric. "My father taught me." "Your father was a peasant?" "Yes. Peasants don't shoot like that." "My father was an unusual peasant." Kale took a step toward her. His presence was intimidating by nature. Decades of battles had engraved threat into every line of his body. Grown men retreated when he approached. Helena didn't retreat. "Edmund Morrow." Kale repeated the name slowly, searching his memory. "From where?" "From the village of Thornhaven, sir. In the eastern hills." Thornhaven. The word hit Kale like a punch to the stomach. He knew that village. Knew it all too well. 15 years ago, during the Valdron campaign, Thornhaven was one of the settlements he had visited. A quick stop to resupply. Some coins exchanged. Some words with the local inhabitants. And one night. A single night in a dusty tavern, where a man with sad eyes and an archer's hands had shared his table and his bottle of wine. The man had been curious, had asked questions about technique, about stance, about the secret behind a truly perfect shot. And Kale, too drunk to be cautious, had answered, had demonstrated, had revealed secrets he swore never to share. Edmund Morrow. Now he remembered the name. The man who had memorized every word, every movement, every breath. The man who had pretended to be an ordinary peasant. Cale looked at Helena with new eyes. Her age, 18, maybe 19 years. Brown hair, brown eyes. But the shape of her chin, the stubborn line of her lips, the way she held her shoulders. Your father, Cale said slowly, is he alive? A shadow crossed Helena's face. No, sir. He died 3 years ago. How? The question was indelicate, cruel, even, but Cale needed to know. Helena held his gaze for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was cold as ice. An arrow, through the heart. While he slept, the world seemed to stop. Cale didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. An arrow, through the heart. While he slept, it was his technique, his method, his signature. 15 years ago, in Valdrin, that was how he eliminated high-value targets. Silently, surgically, an arrow through the window while they slept. No pain, no chance to scream. Someone had copied his method. Someone had murdered Edmund Morrow, and his daughter was standing before him, with eyes that asked for nothing, but promised everything. Helena, Cale said the name slowly, testing it. Why are you really here? The corner of her lips curved. It wasn't a smile, it was a promise. To learn, Master Thornwood, to become the best archer this kingdom has ever seen. She paused. And then, I will find the man who killed my father. 3 months passed. Winter melted into a reluctant spring, which in turn gave way to a summer that arrived earlier than expected. Fort Dunmore transformed from a frozen fortress into a cauldron of heat and dust. And Helena Morrow transformed too, not in her essence that remained the same, a core of inflexible determination wrapped in silence, but her technique, already impressive, had become terrifying. Under Cale Thornwood's tutelage, she absorbed knowledge like dry earth absorbs rain. And Cale couldn't stop watching her. At first, he told himself it was caution, professional vigilance. The girl had a secret, and secrets were dangerous. He needed to discover what she was planning before it was too late. But as the weeks passed, something changed. He began to notice small things. The way she helped the weaker recruits when she thought no one was looking. The infinite patience with which she explained basic techniques to young Aldrich, the same one who had laughed at her on the first day. The wildflower she placed in a glass of water in her tent, an absurd luxury for a peasant in military training. And the nights when she left camp alone, walking to a distant clearing, and practiced, not with common targets, with impossible targets. Tree branches 200 meters away, pine cones hanging on wool threads, apples thrown into the air in the dark. She never missed. Never. One night, Cale decided to follow her. The moon was full, bathing the hills in liquid silver. Helena walked for almost an hour until she reached a clearing he didn't know. In the center stood a single stone, an ancient marker, covered in moss, with symbols worn by time. Helena knelt before the stone and began to speak. At first, Cale couldn't hear the words. He approached silently, using every trick he'd learned in decades of human hunting. When he finally got close enough, what he heard froze his blood. And he taught me everything, father, just as you wanted. Every technique, every secret, the breathing, the pause, the moment between heartbeats. She was talking to her dead father. I'm almost ready now. A few more weeks and I'll know everything he knows. And then I'll find whoever did this to you. She paused. When she continued, her voice was laden with something Cale didn't expect to hear. Doubt. But father, what if I'm wrong? What if it wasn't him? You said you were sure, said you had proof. But 3 years have passed, and I look into his eyes every day, and she stopped. Cale felt his heart race. He doesn't seem like a killer, father. He seems like just a sad man. A man who lost something important a long time ago, and never found it again. Silence. And then, so low it was almost a whisper, sometimes I wonder if you were wrong. If the letter I found was wrong. If the black seal was from someone else. Black seal. The letter sealed with black wax. Cale closed his eyes. He remembered another night, 15 years ago. A messenger who arrived at his camp in the mountains. A letter with no sender. Just 3 words. Edmund Morrow knows. And a name. The name of who had sent the letter. Lord Bertrand Carville. The same man who, 3 years ago, had become the new lord of Thornhaven's lands. The same man who had taken possession of all the Morrow properties after Edmund's death. The same man who now served on Duke Eldric's council. Cale hadn't killed Edmund Morrow, but he knew who had, and Helena was about to make a terrible mistake. He revealed himself. "You're hunting the wrong prey." Helena spun so fast she was a blur. In less than a second, she had an arrow nocked and aimed at Cale's heart. He didn't move. "Lower that," he said calmly. "If I wanted you dead, you would have been dead 3 months ago." Her eyes burned in the moonlight. "You heard." "I heard." "Then you know why I'm here." "I know you're wrong." Helena's hand trembled the first time he'd seen her tremble since the day she arrived. "My father left a letter before he died, describing who visited him the night before, who asked questions about you, who showed too much interest in your techniques." Her voice cracked. "He wrote your name, Thornwood. Wrote that you were back, that someone was paying you to silence him." "Someone was paying," Cale confirmed. "But not me." "Lies." "I've never lied to you, girl. Never." Something in his tone made her hesitate. Cale seized the opening. 3 years ago received a letter sealed with black wax. It said Edmund Morrow knew about me, that he was a threat, that he needed to be eliminated, and you killed. No, nor the letter. Helena blinked. "What?" "Edmund Morrow was never a threat. He was a curious peasant I met in a tavern once. He learned some techniques. So what? The world is full of archers. Killing him would make no sense. Then who? Who sent the letter?" Cale took a step forward. "Who benefited from your father's death? Who took his lands? Who now controls Thornhaven and all the surrounding villages?" Helena's face lost all color. "Lord Carvel." "Lord Carvel." The arrow slowly lowered. He helped me. After my father died. Gave food to our family. Arranged for me to come to training. He said." She stopped. And Cale saw the exact moment the truth hit her. "He said you were dangerous," Helena whispered. "That I needed to get close to you. That when the right moment came, he would give me the signal. And then I would have my revenge. He wanted you to kill me." "Yes. And afterward, he would have killed you. The only person who knew too much. The only witness." Helena staggered backward. Her knees gave way. She fell sitting on the ground, the bow forgotten beside her. And for the first time since Cale had known her, she looked exactly like what she was, a 19-year-old girl who had just discovered her entire life had been a lie. Cale knelt before her, gently, more gently than he had done anything in years. He touched her shoulder. "Your father was a good man, Helena. When I met him, he asked me why I killed. I had no answer. I still don't." She raised her eyes, and there were tears there now. Tears she clearly hated. "What do I do now?" Cale Thornwood, the lonely archer, the ghost of the Valdron Hills, looked at this girl who had planned to kill him, who had trained with him for months with that single purpose, who carried a hatred that didn't belong to her. And for the first time in 15 years, he smiled. A true smile. "Now," he said, "you learn what your father wanted you to learn. Not how to kill, how to protect." Helena was silent for a long moment. Then she extended her hand. Cale took it, and when they stood together in the moonlit clearing, something new was born. Not romance, it was deeper than that. Not friendship, it was more complicated than that. It was purpose. 2 archers, 1 mission. And in the shadows of the Dunmore Hills, the ghosts of the past finally began to rest. A week later, an arrow buried itself in the wall of Lord Bertrand Carvel's chambers. Attached to the shaft was a letter. 3 words, "We know," and a seal. 2 crossed arrows in black wax. When the guards broke down the door, they found the lord in a panic, trying to flee through the window. In the days that followed, documents were discovered. Confessions were extracted. The Duke's council convened a trial. Lord Carvel was executed on the first full moon of autumn. And in a distant clearing, before a moss-covered stone, Helena Morrow knelt one last time. "It's done, father. It's done." Behind her, Cale Thornwood waited in silence. The eastern breeze carried the scent of falling leaves, and when Helena rose and walked to him, she didn't need to say anything. Side by side, the 2 archers descended the hill. The sun set behind them, and in the kingdom's history, a new legend began. The legend of the 2 bows. of the master who found redemption, and of the peasant girl who proved that the greatest arrow of all is the one that never needs to be fired.